I give my welcome on behalf of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown. We're thrilled to host this discussion with Dorothée-Myriam Kellou about her film, In Mansourah, You Separated Us. And you've all had the opportunity to watch this wonderful film online. Kellou is actually a graduate of the Master of Arts in Arab Studies program here at Georgetown, and she also holds an MA in International Relations with a focus on the Arab world from Sciences Po in Lyon, France. She transformed her Georgetown master's thesis into this film, and which depicts, as I'm sure you are well aware, the Algerian War of Independence, when over 2 million Algerian civilians were forcibly displaced by the French army and resettled in camps and towns such as Mansourah. The film received support from international funds in Lebanon, France, Algeria, and Denmark, and Dorothée has spent the last year screening the film all over the world. In addition to her filmmaking work, Kellou won the 2017 Trace Prize for Investigative Reporting. And that was for her work uncovering French cement giant Lafarge's operations in Syria, including payoffs it made to armed groups and indications of covert dealings with ISIS. Kellou recently completed an investigation narrated in the first person on the very subject of this film. The 2-hour podcast is entitled L'Algérie des Camps, and it is available on the France Culture National Radio website. It received the Albert Londres of France Culture Award. And the podcast was made possible thanks to the festivals where Kellou screened her film and met important new witnesses to the events described. So in terms of format, Dorothée has agreed to speak briefly for 10 minutes or so about the filmmaking process, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. And so you should feel free to simply raise your blue hand to be called on, or you can also put your questions into the chat. So thank you so much, Dorothée, for joining us this evening. And we are very much looking forward to hearing your reflections on the film.
Thank you so much, Professor Tucker. It's an honor to be with you. And it's actually very emotional for me because it all started at Georgetown University in the mass program, being a student, attending your class, the class of Osama Abi-Mershed, and Rochelle Davis and Fida Adeli. I mean, so many professors were very much crucial in supporting my ideas and my own research. And I should say that it started, I think, even earlier when I was a child, growing up in Nancy in the east of France, and just being very, wondering why my father was so silent about his past, and why I didn't know anything about Algeria, why I couldn't speak his language, which is Tamazight, the Berber language. So I had so many questions very early on. And I think it was a way for me, like a form of curiosity, a desire to explore my own heritage. And so I started studying Arabic when I was about 15 or 16 years old. But it was quite hard in France. You don't have like many Arabic classes. So it was a bit informal in some ways. And then through my studies in political science and through my studies abroad, first as an exchange student at Georgetown University, also in Cairo, I think I immersed myself into the history of the region and emotionally understood better what was going through people from the region. And I think the very crucial part was also studying and working in Palestine and realizing, the consequences of a military occupation on the the people's psyche, on the people's emotion, and how, it could really affect anyone, and how actually the silence was very key in understanding their own suffering. And when I was at Georgetown University, I had the opportunity to take classes in history. And I would say it was a form of intuition. I decided to study the history of colonial North Africa. And I remember very much the day when Professor Oussama Bimershed told me, you have a father from Algeria, so you should dig into your own history. And at the time, I had absolutely no clue. I had gone through like Egypt and Palestine, I had gone once in Algeria. And so I called my father and asked him if there was no primary sources to write a good research paper in history. And he told me, you should look at my own script, because my father is a filmmaker and he had written a script which is called Letter to My Daughters. And he actually gave me the script at Christmas when I was living in Palestine. And I think he felt I was maybe ready to receive a message he was not able to deliver before that. But at the time, I was not ready emotionally to receive it. So it was only at the time spent at Georgetown University in the math program in a history class that I very much was able to immerse myself and start researching and question my own father's silence, and decide to go actually with him, thanks to a grant from the math program over the summer between 2011 and 2012. And it was 50 years after for him. Like, it was a very big day. And so that's why we decided to actually buy a camera. And the first images of the film were filmed in 2011. So when I went to Algeria, to the village of Mansourah with my father for the math program, for my master thesis actually at Georgetown University. And then because it was so emotionally moving, and because also my father is a filmmaker and he passed on to me the desire to make films, I decided to go back and start writing a script. So, and again, at Georgetown University, in the math program and CCS, everyone was supportive. And I was able to take an independent study class with Professor Adel Eskander, who for a year spent time with me, discussed the idea of the film. We had very long discussion about the relationship to the diaspora, to exile, to silence, and it really helped me write a script, and also to position myself, understand where I was coming from and how to approach this history as a filmmaker. And then, so I'm gonna do like a long story short, but I decided to go back to France, because to me it was the country of cinema. So this is how I decided to go back. And but I realized that it was a very, very hard journey that I was undertaking. First of all, I had funding from the Ministry of Culture in Algeria and the Ministry of Mujahideen. So, and it was in the framework of an official commemoration for the 50th anniversary of the Algerian independence. And so they were giving conditions, to receive the funding. So the government was basically producing my film. And I felt very uncomfortable because it was such an intimate story, and I was trying to reclaim a heritage that was for me extremely hard to access. And so I decided to reject the funding and try to create like a co-production between France, Algeria, look for independent funding. And I realized it was very hard because in France, people were very skeptical. First of all, I had never made a film. Then it was a personal story, so they were afraid of my distance towards the topic. And then they said, enough of the Algerian war. It's been over 50 years. Don't you want to, you know, forget and do something else, work on something else? So I felt there were many obstacles, like emotionally, financially, even politically. I was very much facing a form of denial, and in Algeria, a form of, I would say, hijacking history. You know, how you can tell history, and yeah. So it was a very long journey just to be able to be independent financially and write the story in a very personal way. I work with my father, who in the beginning was very much against the idea of even being filmed. He was like, "This is not my story. Film the others." And one day he came to me and realized that he was actually looking good on screen. So that made him feel very comfortable. And I think at this point, after all these years, you know, of asking questions, going to the village, trying to gather funds that were independent politically from, you know, any government in particular, trying to balance all of this and find my own voice, because it was really hard coming from a, you know, more research background, to move to what they call creative documentary, so where you have to be very imaginative in the form and find ways to tell story, but with your own voice as well, your own way of looking at things. So yeah, I think at the end I managed to produce it with the help of a producer in France, a producer in Algeria, and a producer in Denmark, who came at the very last stage of the production process. And I was very lucky at some point to, you know, meet the right people, attending a writing residency, attending you know, workshops where I could meet director of photography who worked in Algeria, made film in Algeria in an independent manner, and who were very supportive of the project, who could feel like the need of telling a story that was untold, that was silenced, in a very intimate manner. So now is Mansourah, you separated us. I have other ideas in mind. It's just the beginning of, I would say, contribution to a history that still is very much unknown in France and Algeria. And you know, when I actually found about this this part of the history, I was so, in a way, shocked, you know, to not even know about this. And I was, you know, I felt like I needed to share this history, not through a research or an article or a book, but very much through a cinematic language, because I felt that my father was not able to pass on his language, his memories, but he was able to pass on his love for cinema to me. So it was, in a way, also a gift back, you know, a letter to my father back, as he gave me a letter to me and my sister. So yes, so I'm happy to open the floor to the questions you may have and share more.
Thank you so much. So as I said at the outset, you can use the raise hand function or type your question into the chat, whichever one you are more comfortable with. Yeah. And I'll call on you and but send you along to Dorothée. Yeah. Yes, Professor Adeli.
Thank you. Thanks. I guess I just have a well, first, hello, everyone. Hello, Dorothée. I have a comment and a question. So I just watched the film right before I joined this talk. So between my class and this event, I just watched it. And it really touched me. Like I'm even afraid I'll get emotional, just like particularly this kind of traveling with your father to tell this story. It was very touching. And then also the sentiment I felt from the folks that you spoke to, who seemed really much to appreciate the opportunity to tell this story, even though it was painful and traumatic. And I felt that very strongly. and maybe I'm getting a little bit emotional myself because it made me think a lot about my own father, who's not from Algeria, who just passed away a few years ago. But just sort of all the stories that will leave with this generation. So it's a very powerful thing that you've done here to capture these stories. So that's kind of the personal comment I just wanted to share. Also, the opening scene made me think a lot about what's going on in the US right now, like the statue. And that's kind of what my question's about, because your father talks about passing this statue, and there was a similar statue in Algeria, right? And I thought a lot about what, all these discussions we've been having about statues and monuments in the US, and the need to, wanting to take them down, and these really painful, horrible histories surrounding these statues. So I thought about that immediately, and I just wondered if you'd been thinking about these kind of connections and the ways in which this particular French history is memorialized in France. And yeah, so it's not so much a question, but kind of.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's wonderful, and I'm very touched because, at the end, I made this film also for people to connect emotionally. And, while writing the research paper in the math program, it was a very important experience to document the history. But I was a bit frustrating about one aspect, which was, how you go through it emotionally and how people go through it emotionally. And that's a very hard aspect to actually translate in a research paper. And I was so touched by the emotions that I felt in the village that at some point I thought it's the only way I can capture this, through, maybe you can do it in a writing, through fiction, or but I felt like the documentary form was maybe the best to create this connection with others. And thank you for your comment also about your father. Allah yarhamu. And yes, for the statue, it was very interesting because, the first time, I think, sometimes you reach a point in history when you don't realize in the beginning you're taking a certain path. And when I was reading about the statue in the math program, it actually didn't strike me at all. I was like, okay, fine, a statue. And then, while researching and thinking, going back to France, living there, realizing like all this colonial, I would say, memories that was very much present in the public space. And the statue, I started looking at it very differently, because I used to take also this road to go to school, see the statue every day, but I never made the connection with my father's story. And actually the statue was on the way from his village to Algiers. So he would actually see the statue every couple of days. And because you don't represent the human character historically in his culture, it was very striking to him. But I mean, there are statues everywhere where I live in France, so I don't look at them, I'm like, okay, this is like another soldier, and now I'm like, every time I go back, I look at the statue and there is such like a strong meaning attached to it now. And I realized that it is the ghost of my father in some way. And if it's the ghost of my father, it might be the ghost of other, Algerians living in France. And through the podcast I just finished, I actually became a friend in some ways with the grandson of the one who made this statue. He actually listened to the podcast, and it was very surprising because he was actually a conscript, and he actually went to the camps and was able to talk about the camps. And he's the grandson of this soldier, who is like a hero of the colonial conquest in Algeria. And so we had a discussion about the statue, like should it be toppled or not? Should there be a sign so people can understand the meaning of it? But at this stage in France, unfortunately, we really trying to open doors, but every time there's a feeling that doors are closed very quickly. As quickly as they are open, they close. And so if you had talked to me about 2 months ago, I was very enthusiastic. But now, like, there is a new prime minister in France who is like fed up with the colonial period, very much into this denial dynamic that is present in France. While about 3 years ago, the President Macron was talking about colonialism as a crimes against humanity. So there is this schizophrenia in France, and it's still very hard today to open questions. But I think some people are receptive, and I realized it with the film, and it's also why I wanted it to be emotional in some ways, because through emotion people open their hearts and they can listen. If you talk more in terms of discourse, they close very quickly. They don't want to, they think you're ideological, dogmatic, and they don't want to listen. So I don't know if I answered your question. I just like a comment going many directions, but that says a lot, I think, about the situation in France and the fact that we're very much struggling still.
Yeah, we're a bit schizophrenic in the US as well.
Yes.
In terms of how we want to talk about this history, but thank you very much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was thinking not that different in many ways. Yeah. So Halima.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. I have to say I did not watch the movie. I thought for some reason we were going to watch it. I'm a French Algerian, and even based on what you said, I still have a number of questions for you. So maybe I'll just ask you one, and then if somebody else wants to ask another one, I'll ask the other ones later on. The first one is to the film director that you are. What do you think of the fact that France poses as a country of freedom of speech, and yet not once one of the first 50 most important movies in the world, The Battle of Algiers, has never ever been shown on a French TV channel? Maybe you're aware, maybe you watched a few years ago, there was a TV movie which was shown, and after that there was a debate which was very, very tense. This is the only time when, they spoke really about the war of Algeria on a normal channel, but the Battle of Algiers has never been shown in France. What do you think about this?
Yes, thank you for your question. Actually, it was shown in France after the war. And I think it's in '67, just after it won an award in Venezia, the Mostra de Venise. But actually, there was an attack against the movie theater from the far-right groups OAS. And this is like something I remember. I don't know if there were other screenings, maybe they were, but it's most of the time very confidential screenings. And most French people I know from my age don't know about the movie.
But it was not shown on an official TV channel.
Yes, okay.
What I mean?
Yeah. I mean, because first it's based on the memoirs of an FLN fighter. So, I mean, at the time, who was considered a terrorist. So I think, and he plays the character, his character in the film. So I think it was very shocking to the French audience at the time to have like another version of the history written by an FLN member, played by a FLN member. But I think it's a very important film to these days, and personally I tried to screen it a couple of times in personal circles, even to French soldiers I may know who actually are serving now in Mali, and through this film they very much reflect about the history that they are taking part into through this counter revolutionary war against terrorist groups, you know. Yeah, I think, you know, it's to this day we very much struggle, you know, to make films about this period, especially like you know, you can make like this kind of documentary films I made, you know, that are screened to a public, but from, you know, a certain maybe educational level. Although I try to go to high school, I try to go to prisons, I try to go to, you know, many different parts of France to screen the film, and not limit it to, I would say, festival audience. But the issue we have is not to make like popular movies about this period. But I think slowly we're going to reach this stage because there is a strong desire. You can see it in books, you can see it in articles, you can see it in many speeches. Like there is a desire to know the history of father, grandfather. And there was like a survey recently made by the Ministry of the Army in France. About 50% of the young generation, 18-25 years old, has a direct connection to the war through a grandfather, a great uncle. So from all parts of the conflict, you know, all like it could be like former Pieds Noirs, former French settler, former FLN member, you know, from very, very different perspective and point of view. Many of the young generation has like a direct connection to this history and want to know, like, first of all, like what happened and why was it silenced in so many ways in high school books. And if we go back to the film and the history, I'm like trying to document, the camps were very key in you know, trying to enroll more Algerians into the French army, because in the camps the resources, the economic resources were lacking, because the people were far from their lands, so it was hard for them to cultivate their lands. And so many of them actually, because of the pressure, the economic pressure, also the political pressure, ended up being, you know, enrolled in the French army just as a way to survive and support their families. So of course, if we, you know, only write the history of Harkis as you know, traitors, we won't understand, you know, the situation. And I very much agree that we need films like the Battle of Algiers to be screened, more, you know, films and debates and books. And but I think it's slowly going there, you know. I think it's the next wave, you know. We had a wave about in terms of memory, the French, you know, collaboration with the Nazi authorities during the Second World War, and now we're reaching a phase where we're very much questioning also the colonial history. And you had writers like Leonora Miano, like the French Cameroonese writer, who is very vocal and very, you know, straightforward and asking very important questions. So there, I think I'm optimistic in some ways. I'm optimistic.
Good. Are there other people who would like to ask a question at this juncture? If you would allow me, Dorothée, I would like to ask you a question, if I may. And that is, you know, in the whole process is very fascinating to me of moving from, I mean, I'm a historian myself, so moving from a work of the work you did in your master's thesis, which was a very in-depth, very finely documented academic work on this subject, right? And then, you know, when I saw the film, it was like, oh, I kind of see how that happened, but I wanted to ask you, what was the most difficult part of that, would you say? Is that kind of movement from having done this in the first instance as a in-depth historical study, and then moving into this really very different medium? And, you know, what were the challenges, would you say, the biggest challenge?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question, because I think it was the hardest part, you know, trying to, because there were many threads, you know. There was indeed the research about the resettlement camps that I had documented. There was also my father's own story, you know, as a, you know, actually intellectual, educated in French, who then left his village and actually studied cinema and settled in France, married a French woman. So there was also something very interesting to me in some ways to, you know, explore. And then there was also my, you know, story and my sister's story, you know, the generation that grew up in France, being completely disconnected to the heritage, the language, the memories that were completely erased, trying to understand, you know, I would say the weight of denial and how to this day it affects us, to, you know, growing up in France, living in France. And it's like excluding a part of the population in some ways from the official narrative. And so I had all these threads, you know, and I was trying to find a way to combine all these threads. And at some point, I even had ideas about using animation sequences, because I was going through so many nightmares that I wanted to animate, you know, soldiers waking me at night, trying to silence me, and like all these crazy nightmares that I actually had. And so at some point, you know, while writing and talking with professionals, I realized that I had to trust, you know, the story and the emotion that people would deliver to me, and that I didn't need to add so many layers, to raise so many questions and so many stakes. And I remember the comment of a filmmaker who had read my script, and he told me, "Why don't you trust your father?" And is, I'm sure, a very good storyteller. And I didn't have the distance, you know, because also I was coming from a history background, and everything needed to be cross-checked in order to have any kind of credibility. So I was like adding like witnesses just so that one piece of information told by one person would be verified and confirmed. So I had about 30 characters. And so, yeah, and at some point I had to make choices. And this is how, and it was the hardest part. And to this day, I still have some scenes in my mind that I shot that I would like to add, you know, and rewrite. And I think we all go through that, like even when we write a PhD dissertation, you know, all the archive that we've read and wanted to use and we're not using, and that says so much more. And but then I understood that it's a work in process and that much more can be done and told. And the most important at the end to me was that it can be shared, and that actually it creates some kind of curiosity, and people have a desire to dig into this history or in their own history. And I think that's the most important part for me at the end of the process.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Does anybody else have a question? Yes. David Stenner.
Hello. I hope I'm visible and audible. I teach North African history at a liberal arts college in Virginia, so I really enjoyed the movie. And as you describe it, sort of as a personal letter back to your father, that really makes sense. And I like how, you know, you get these very personal, partially very emotional testimonies of these events. That was really great. But at the same time, my wife really wanted to watch it with me, right? So we watched it together. And I could clearly tell after about like 15 or 20 minutes, she had totally zoned out because she didn't know anything about Algeria or North Africa in general. And so I wonder, you know, clearly, again, as you describe it, that was sort of like very intentional to describe this very personal story. But when you go out and you screen it, let's say, I don't know, high school class, right, where I would assume that maybe some people have some sort of family relationship, but the vast majority don't really know very much to nothing. How does that, like, what's the experience, right? Does it lead to general silence, or does it have this effect of people wanting you to talk about the historical background, getting it themselves?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. Actually, what I realized is, this feeling of being zoned out, I think was also intentional, because first of all, this is how I experienced the whole journey. I was zoned out, like, nothing was very clear to me. It was very hard. I was even confusing because I didn't have access to the language. Now I understand it better, but at the time it was really hard. So I was confusing even in the terms, the French army, the FLN, so the askar or the jeish, and and to me it's like a poetic puzzle, because I think the relationship we have to memory is very, in some ways, mysterious, and it's there is no like a straightforward answer. And you have to make your own effort to put pieces together and understand the journey. And also feeling zoned out was also intentional in some ways, because this is also the feeling that the displaced population had when leaving the village, finding themselves in a new environment without knowing anyone. And so that was also a feeling I thought is interesting, because people experience it themselves. And it's a very disturbing feeling, actually. To not have like clear repairs and landmarks, and trying to figure out. And at the end, I thought, why trying to overstate everything, while my journey was extremely, in some ways, difficult to understand and have access to this history. And the displaced population itself was actually, in some way, very lost also. So this feeling of being lost, I realized, is also interesting to the audience, because it in some way forces the audience to reflect and try to understand. It's not an easy movie. It's like, but at the end, if they go through the whole film, they get it, they understand it. And if there are some points that they don't understand, they might have questions and try to answer themselves. So so that's how I realized I made the film, and I realized it's also received. And not all have connection to the history, because I screened it in Tunisia, in Algeria, in Germany, in Denmark, in Canada, in many different places. And I think what helps, first of all, is like my father is like in some ways like a guide through the journey, through the puzzle. So it's a landmark within the unknown, I would say. And so that very much helps. I had another version of the film that was about 1 hour and 40 minutes. That was much, much longer, and that was actually documenting more the history, but it was harder to enter the journey and not get lost. So at the end, I made a compromise between being completely lost and still, getting it and following the story. I don't know if it answered the question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Great. Jasper Jordan.
Hello, Dorothée. Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank you for hosting this event and being here with us. And also congratulations on the success of the film. And obviously, I feel somewhat connected, having followed your journey from master's thesis to creating this film. And I wonder, you've touched on this before in bits and pieces. One of the aspects of the film that really interests me is the connection, this idea of ancestrality, memory, and history. you know, how it's your father's story, but it's also the stories of all of these people who were affected by this, and then it becomes your story. And there's also a sense of remembering, right? Like, you know, putting, as you create this narrative, you're maybe remembering your own identity and inserting yourself into this history where you didn't have language for it before, but now you have one. So I wonder if you could touch a little bit on that, just a little bit more in depth.
Thank you so much, Jasper. So nice to see you. Yeah, so the relationship between memory and history, is this your question? Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, like all these testimonies worked very much as a form of oral history. And what I realized is that by doing this master thesis, I was able to document and cross-check, you know, all events and testimonies, and using archives, using other testimonies also from French soldiers I had met in France for the master thesis. And at the end, you know, I realized that I could actually trust these testimonies, and I think it was a very important preliminary work to research, document, cross-check, and then, you know, pick certain testimonies that could actually tell the story through a number of just a number of characters. And I was sure of what was being said, and I had verified it, and it gave me more, I would say, confidence, you know, and in making the film and putting all these pieces together. I was able to tell the story through their own testimonies, and not always look for an archive to validate what they were saying, and actually use these archives or these images as a way for them to tell their stories. So it would become a tool to tell the story, a way to help them to tell their stories. So yeah, and I think, you know, like in some ways, I realized that it touches like more people, that it goes through testimonies only, because people can connect to the emotion directly. And at the end, what we lack also is, you know, oral history. You know, the stories told emotionally by people to people, and not only very well methodologically documented documentaries. It's great, but personally, to me, it's more boring. Like I love hearing people's stories, and less maybe to, you know, I prefer reading a history book than actually watching a history documentary. Yeah, and as I said previously, like this emotional layer was very important to me to understand the history. And I didn't want too many archives or experts or to actually put weight on this. I very much wanted to create a space where they could have their own stories told, and not, you know, being maybe undermined by any other expert who would like to nuance what they just said. And yeah, to me, it was not the most important. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, shall we give another go back to Halima again, who I believe has another question?
Hi again. I have a few questions. I'm just going to try and go as fast as I can. You said that you developed this subject in Georgetown University. I myself discovered completely Algerian literature in French in a UK university. Just like you, I was a foreign student at Reading University in England. And I was actually amazed, and at the same time, I was a bit upset that it was actually English people teaching me about my own identity. So do you think that we managed to get this information and be able to actually develop and work on those subjects abroad because there is maybe more freedom of speech? Or do you think this is because these are neutral countries, they are less passionate maybe about the subject? And then the other point I wanted to ask you about is, you mentioned earlier on Palestine, and you spoke about the type of oppression that people could feel. I would like to ask you whether you were interested in the Palestinian cause or the Palestinian situation because of your history as your heritage from Algeria. And also, there is an Algerian woman, she's a French Algerian woman called Ouria Boutelja. I don't know if you've heard of her before. She's part of a group called Les Indigènes de la République. And she explains that we are still in a colonial system. So don't you think that what's happening right now in France is a real demonstration that we are still actually in a colonial system? And even though in theory we are supposed to have the same rights, we actually don't have the same rights.
Yeah, first of all, I was, I think, also shocked, to discover my own history in the United States. And I realize now that maybe I would have never found out just by staying in France, because I couldn't find ways to actually explore my own heritage while being in France. So that's why I moved for so many years, studying Arabic, the history of the region, living in Egypt, Palestine, the US, and it really opened door to me and to my heritage and to my father's own heritage and to a country heritage. I think that, if I chose to go to Palestine, it's all very based on intuition. You want to go somewhere for a reason. And I very much wanted to be a witness of the military occupation in Palestine, like understand, how the occupation affects a society and how it transforms a society. And it was a way for me also to explore the colonial history in Algeria. Because it's a hard history to understand, and through books, like, I couldn't really figure out what it meant. So it was through an experience emotionally very strong that I could really understand, how you can actually create some form of silencing, and how a form of erasure happens, and how villages are destroyed and people displaced, and in the process they lose their identity, that they try to actually recreate abroad in exile. But all of this was very helpful in some ways for me to understand my own family history and the history of Algeria. So for what you're describing currently in France, it's a very worrying state. As I was saying before, about 2 months ago, I was a bit optimistic. I was traveling around with my film, and I could feel that people were interested in hearing about the stories. And I had just finished a podcast that was on a national radio. So I was like, oh, maybe people are more open now to these questions. And you had an international wave of like toppling statues and questioning the history. And now we're in a very hard situation, like with this new wave of attacks in France, and also, some ways like so many people feel directly stigmatized and associated with this attack, although they are just like Muslims, and they feel very much, I would say, fragilized emotionally, psychologically. And I don't know if we're still in a colonial state, some people said we never left the colonial era. We're not in a post-colonial era. But what I can say is that the worrying part to me is this very strong erasure. It's a form of political erasure of history, of heritage, and not being able to explore this heritage and connect the dots. The way a part of the population in a colonial period was treated, mistreated, and non-considered, and forcibly changed in their language, in their culture, or neglected, or all of this happened historically. And if we don't explore this part of the history, we won't understand also the anger of some of the descendants of this population. And as you say, as a daughter of Harki, like it's a very hard situation, and I have friends who are in the same situation as you are, who are trying to understand, a decision that happened more than 50 years ago and changed the fate of many generations that came after, and to this day are struggling with the narrative, the official narrative. They are all traitors and collaborators in Algeria, and in France they were all beloved of France and very supportive of the political system, economic system. No, they were, for many of them, caught in a system and crushed in this system. And if we don't go back to this history, I don't know how we're gonna actually manage. And yeah, it's very worrying. And myself, at some point, I wanted to go back to the US and maybe start a PhD and leave, all the toxicity of the discourses that I could hear every day on the radio, on TV, in the streets. But at some point I said, if we all leave, and many of my friends have left to Canada, to the US, to the UK, even some went back to Algeria, went to Turkey. But if we all leave, what will happen? In some way, it's a brain drain of an educated part of the population that can reflect on this question. And so for me, at some point, I decided it's a struggle. So I stay and I struggle here. And maybe it's easier for me because I have a French name, I have a French mother, but I feel also this very, difficult position to be in when you have to justify all the time that you're not attacking France as a country by exploring the colonial period.
Does anybody else have something that they would like to ask Dorothée? If not, I'm going to have to, thank her so warmly for being with us this evening and taking this time. It is such a wonderful film. I think for those of us who saw it were so moved, actually, and I must say the silences were incredibly effective and moving. And thank you very much for making it, and for sharing it with us.
And maybe to finish on a more positive note, because as Halima was describing, the situation is very worrying in France, and I think those who live are maybe those who have the means to live, for many of them. So, but I very much hope that we keep working on these questions and contribute to raise awareness and not, end up being so defeated in some ways. So I really want to thank, and it's from the heart, CCAS and the MASS program, because it was key in this endeavor. And I very much wish that you keep supporting us and the generation that is coming, because the work you do is more than useful and is very meaningful. So thank you so much. And I was very pleased to come back with this film, and I hope to come back with a new film or a new I don't know. Let's see.
Well, we'll be
Thank
waiting.
you.
We'll be waiting. Thank you so much, Dorothée. And
Yes, thanks.
thank you, everybody. Thank you, wonderful audience. Thank you for your questions. It was wonderful to have you with us.